There's a 10-year-old girl who's been sexually assaulted and beaten to death. And you're telling me you don't want to test the DNA evidence because it might prove the men you convicted are innocent? This wasn't a question posed by a defense attorney. It was a statement made by investigators trying to get prosecutors to do the right thing. And for 10 years, the answer was no. On February 25, 1983, 10-year-old Janine Nicarico was homesick from school in Naperville, Illinois. By mid-afternoon, she had been abducted from her home, sexually assaulted, and murdered. Her body was found the next day on a wooded trail, blindfolded and beaten to death. What should have been a straightforward investigation became one of the most egregious wrongful conviction cases in American history. Within a year, arrests were made. 2 men were convicted and sentenced to death. But while those 2 men sat on death row, a serial killer already in custody for murdering other young girls confessed to killing Janine. He said he acted alone. He provided details only the killer would know. His pattern of crimes matched Janine's murder perfectly. Prosecutors dismissed his confession. They refused to investigate. The 2 men remained on death row. For the next 10 years, DNA evidence sat preserved in storage, evidence that could prove innocence or guilt with scientific certainty. Defense attorneys demanded testing. Investigators urged testing. The technology existed, and prosecutors fought it until courts finally forced their hand. When the DNA was finally tested, it didn't match either man on death row. It matched the serial killer who had confessed a decade earlier. 2 innocent men had spent over 10 years in prison for a crime they didn't commit. They came within days of execution. More than 1,600 people were interviewed. Over 60 suspects were investigated and cleared, and the real killer had confessed from the beginning. How does a serial killer confess to murder and get ignored for a decade? Why would prosecutors fight DNA testing that could reveal the truth? We're unraveling a case that exposed everything broken in the American justice system. Welcome to Cold Case Echoes. Before we continue this heartbreaking story, take a moment to hit subscribe and like this video. Janine Nicarico's case led to the complete abolition of the death penalty in an entire state because prosecutors fought to protect a wrongful conviction rather than admit they were wrong. Your support helps bring these forgotten stories to light and ensures that truth is never buried again. Hit that notification bell so you never miss these extraordinary stories. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below. What makes this case especially infuriating is that the truth was never hidden. The confession was on record. The DNA was preserved. The evidence was there from the beginning. But a system built on the pursuit of justice became a system committed to protecting its own mistakes, no matter the cost. This case didn't just destroy 2 innocent lives, it delayed justice for a murdered child's family for more than 2 decades. 7 law enforcement officials were indicted for their role in the wrongful convictions. Civil rights lawsuits awarded millions in damages, and Illinois became the 16th state to abolish the death penalty, citing this case as proof that the system was too broken to trust with the power of life and death. Why did it take another serial killer's victims for anyone to believe his confession about Janine? How did 2 innocent men nearly get executed while the real killer sat in prison for other crimes? Today we return to that February morning in 1983. We trace the investigation that went wrong, the confession that was buried. This is a story of a family's endurance, a system's failure, and a truth that refused to stay buried. But before this case rewrote the rules of criminal justice and led an entire state to abolish the death penalty, it began in a quiet suburb where a 10-year-old girl stayed home sick from school. Long before she became a symbol of everything wrong with the American justice system, Janine Nicarico was a girl who loved horses, who was learning to read, and who had her whole life ahead of her. Janine Nicarico was born on July 7, 1972, in Naperville, Illinois. She was the youngest of 3 daughters born to Thomas and Patricia Nicarico. Her family described her as the peacemaker, always the giggly one, always stepping in when her sisters argued. She loved horses, puppies, gardening, and baking. Reading hadn't always come easily to Janine. In her earlier grades, she struggled with it. But by 4th grade, a teacher found a way to motivate her using horse-themed lessons, and Janine blossomed. By 5th grade, she loved reading and looked forward to school. Christine and Kathy would later say that Janine brought light wherever she went. She was joyful, sensitive, and wanted everyone around her to be happy. The Nicarico family lived in a quiet neighborhood in Naperville, a suburb of Chicago known for its safety and close-knit community. Thomas worked as an engineer at a firm in Chicago. Patricia worked as a school secretary at Ellsworth Elementary School in Naperville. They were a family that valued togetherness, that believed in the goodness of their community, and that never imagined something like this could happen to them. On the morning of Friday, February 25th, 1983, Janine woke up sick. She had the flu. Her parents decided she should stay home from school. Thomas left for work early that morning. Christine and Kathy went to school as usual. Patricia left for work but came home around noon to check on Janine and make her lunch. She made grilled cheese, Janine's favorite, and sat with her daughter while she ate. Janine seemed fine, tired, but fine. Patricia returned to work. Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, she called home to check on Janine again. Janine answered. She sounded cheerful, bubbly. They talked about a television program Janine was watching and whether she should write a letter to her grandparents. Patricia told her to rest and stay inside. Janine said she would. It was the last time Patricia would hear her daughter's voice. Around 3 o'clock that afternoon, Kathy came home from school and found the front door ajar. The strike plate was on the ground. The molding had been torn off. The door had been kicked in. Janine was gone. Kathy immediately called her parents. Thomas and Patricia rushed home. The house showed signs of a struggle, but nothing valuable had been taken. No television, no jewelry, nothing except a blanket and a sheet. And Janine, the police were called. A massive search began. Volunteers flooded the area. The FBI was brought in. A $10,000 reward was offered for information. The community of Naperville, a place where violent crime was almost unheard of, was shattered. Parents who had always felt safe began locking their doors at night, keeping their children closer, questioning everything they thought they knew about their town. On Sunday, February 27th, 2 hikers searching along the Illinois Prairie Path found a body in heavy underbrush about 45 feet off the trail near Eola Road. It was approximately 6 miles from the Nicarico home. It was Janine. She had been blindfolded with a towel taped around her head. Her nose was broken. She had been sexually assaulted and beaten to death with a blunt object. The little girl who loved horses and reading, who was the peacemaker in her family, who brought light into every room she entered, was gone. She was 10 years old. The investigation into Janine's murder began immediately. Police canvassed the neighborhood, interviewed everyone who had been near the Nicarico home on February 25th, and searched for any sign of who had kicked in that door and taken a 10-year-old girl in the middle of the day. They found a boot print on the kicked-in door. They found tire tracks near the area where Janine's body had been dumped, but they had no witnesses, no suspects, and no clear direction. The $10,000 reward generated hundreds of tips. Most led nowhere. Investigators followed every lead they could, but nothing substantial emerged. The case was stalling. Then, on May 9th, 1983, less than 3 months after Janine's murder, a 20-year-old man named Rolando Cruz walked into the police station with information about the crime. Cruz told detectives he had a vision. He said he'd had a dream about what happened to Janine Nicarico. He described an assailant striking her from behind with a baseball bat inside her home, wrapping her body in a sheet and blanket, carrying her out, and dumping her in a wooded area near a creek. He mentioned details like a broken nose, head blows that left a depression in the ground, and her body being left in a field. Some of these details had not been released to the public. Detectives took notice. Cruz framed his account as a psychic vision, not a confession. He claimed he was offering the information to help solve the case. But investigators didn't believe he was psychic. They believed he knew too much, and they began to suspect he was involved. What investigators didn't know at the time was that Cruz was fabricating the story. He was hoping to claim the $10,000 reward. He thought if he provided enough detail, police would believe he had inside information from someone else and pay him for helping solve the case. Instead, his plan backfired. He became a suspect. Shortly after Cruz came forward, police received an anonymous tip suggesting that a man named Alejandro Hernandez might have information about the crime. On March 14, 1983, detectives contacted Hernandez and brought him in for questioning. Hernandez, who knew Cruz, gave inconsistent statements and at various points implicated Cruz and others. Whether Hernandez was also angling for the reward or simply trying to cooperate with police remained unclear, but his shifting accounts made him a suspect as well. A third man, Stephen Buckley, was brought into the investigation after the boot print on the Nicarico door was examined by an expert who claimed it matched Buckley's boots. This claim would later be discredited, but at the time, it was enough to make Buckley a suspect. By March of 1984, all three men, Rolando Cruz, Alejandro Hernandez, and Stephen Buckley, were formally indicted for the murder, rape, and kidnapping of Janine Nicarico. The problem was that there was no physical evidence tying any of them to the crime. No DNA matches, no fingerprints, no witnesses placing them at the scene, no items from the crime scene linked to them. The tire tracks didn't match any vehicle they owned. The prosecution's case rested almost entirely on Cruz's so-called vision statement and testimony from jailhouse informants, people who claimed Cruz and Hernandez had confessed to them while in custody. Jailhouse informants are notoriously unreliable. Many are facing their own charges and are willing to say whatever prosecutors want to hear in exchange for reduced sentences or other benefits. But in 1985, their testimony was considered credible enough to take to trial. What made the case even more troubling was that one of the lead detectives on the investigation resigned before the trial began. He told colleagues he believed Cruz, Hernandez, and Buckley were innocent. He didn't think they had anything to do with Janine's murder, but his concerns were ignored. The prosecutors were confident. They had confessions, or what they were calling confessions. They had jailhouse informants willing to testify. They had a community demanding justice, and they were going to trial. For Thomas and Patricia Nicarico, the arrests brought a complicated mix of relief and confusion. They wanted justice for their daughter. They wanted someone held accountable. But as the case moved forward, questions began to emerge. Questions about the evidence, about the confessions, about whether the right people were actually being charged. Still, they trusted the system. They believed that if these men were being prosecuted, there must be a reason. They believed the truth would come out in court. They had no idea that the truth was about to be buried for more than a decade. The trial of Rolando Cruz, Alejandro Hernandez, and Stephen Buckley began in early 1985 in DuPage County Circuit Court. It was a joint trial, meaning all three men were tried together for the murder, rape, and kidnapping of Janine Nicarico. The prosecution's case was led by Thomas Knight, Patrick King, and Robert Killander prosecutors, who were determined to secure convictions. They presented their evidence to the jury, and from the beginning, it was clear that the case would rest almost entirely on two pillars: Cruz's vision statement and the testimony of jailhouse informants. The vision statement was presented as a confession. Prosecutors argued that Cruz's account of the crime contained details only the killer could have known. They claimed his description of how Janine had been struck from behind, how her body had been wrapped in a sheet and blanket, and how she had been left in a field with a broken nose and head injuries proved his involvement. The defense argued that Cruz had never confessed to anything. They pointed out that he had framed his statement as a psychic vision or dream, not an admission of guilt. They argued that some of the details Cruz mentioned could have been pieced together from news reports or rumors circulating in the community. But the prosecution insisted that Cruz knew too much, and they painted his vision as a thinly veiled confession. The second major component of the prosecution's case came from jailhouse informants. 5 men testified that Cruz or Hernandez had confessed to them while in custody. One informant claimed that Cruz had told him, "I did kind of kill a little girl." Others offered similar accounts. They testified that Cruz and Hernandez had bragged about the crime, described details. The problem was that all of these informants had something to gain. Several were facing their own criminal charges and were hoping for reduced sentences or favorable treatment in exchange for their testimony. Their stories were inconsistent. Some of the details they claimed Cruz or Hernandez had shared didn't match the facts of the case, but prosecutors vouched for their credibility, and the jury heard their testimony. The defense attacked the informants relentlessly. They pointed out the inconsistencies, the lack of physical evidence, and the clear motivation these men had to lie. But they were fighting an uphill battle. The community wanted justice, the prosecution was confident, and the jury was faced with a horrific crime and a narrative that, however flawed, seemed to point toward guilt. On February 22, 1985, the jury returned with verdicts. Rolando Cruz was found guilty of murder, rape, and kidnapping. He was sentenced to death. Alejandro Hernandez was found guilty of murder, rape, and kidnapping. He was also sentenced to death. Stephen Buckley's case ended in a hung jury. The prosecution eventually dropped charges against him in 1987 after the bootprint evidence that had initially implicated him was discredited. For Thomas and Patricia Nicarico, the verdicts brought a sense of closure. The men who had killed their daughter were going to be held accountable. Justice, it seemed, had been served. The community of Naperville breathed a sigh of relief. The case was over. The killers were behind bars. But there was a problem that would take years to fully surface. The men on death row were innocent. And while Rolando Cruz and Alejandro Hernandez sat in prison awaiting execution, the person who had actually killed Janine Nicarico was already in custody for other crimes. He had been arrested just months after the trial ended. And in November of 1985, he confessed. In June of 1985, just a few months after Rolando Cruz and Alejandro Hernandez were convicted and sentenced to death, a 28-year-old man named Brian Dugan was arrested in LaSalle County, Illinois. Dugan wasn't arrested for Janine Nicarico's murder. He was arrested for separate crimes that would reveal him to be a serial rapist and killer. On July 15, 1984, a 27-year-old nurse named Donna Schnorr was driving home from work when her car was run off the road. The person who forced her off the road attacked her, beat her, raped her, and drowned her in a quarry. Her body was found days later. On June 2, 1985, a 7-year-old girl named Melissa Ackerman was riding her bike with a friend near a forest preserve. A man in a car pulled up, grabbed Melissa, and drove away. The friend escaped and ran for help. Melissa's body was found the next day in a creek. She had been raped and drowned. Brian Dugan was arrested for both murders. The evidence against him was overwhelming. His car matched descriptions from witnesses. His behavior fit the pattern. He was facing multiple charges that would almost certainly result in life in prison or the death penalty. While in custody and negotiating with prosecutors to avoid the death penalty, Dugan made a confession that should have stopped everything. In November of 1985, Brian Dugan confessed to killing Janine Nicarico. He said he acted alone. He said he had broken into the Nicarico home during a burglary, abducted Janine, sexually assaulted her, and killed her. He provided details about the crime scene, the method of abduction, and the location where her body had been left. He described things that had not been made public, details that only the killer would know. His confession wasn't vague or uncertain. It was detailed, specific, and consistent with the evidence that had been collected in 1983. And his pattern of crimes made his confession even more credible. Donna Schnorr had been abducted, raped, and killed. Melissa Ackerman had been abducted, raped, and killed. Both were attacked during the day in opportunistic, brutal crimes. Both attacks involved abduction, sexual assault, and murder. Both bodies were dumped in remote areas. Everything about his crimes matched what had happened to Janine. The prosecutors handling Janine's case were notified of Dugan's confession. They reviewed it, they considered it, and they dismissed it. They claimed Dugan was lying. They argued he was trying to manipulate the system to avoid the death penalty for his other murders by confessing to a crime he didn't commit. They said his confession was a ploy, an attempt to muddy the waters and create reasonable doubt. They refused to investigate him further. They refused to charge him with Janine's murder. They insisted that the right men, Rolando Cruz and Alejandro Hernandez, were already on death row, and that Dugan's confession was nothing more than a calculated lie. This decision was shocking for several reasons. First, Dugan had no reason to confess falsely. He was already facing life in prison or death for the murders of Donna Schnorr and Melissa Ackerman. Adding another murder to his record didn't help him. If anything, it made things worse. There was no benefit to confessing to Janine's murder unless he had actually done it. Second, his pattern of crimes was undeniable. He had killed 2 other females in strikingly similar ways. The idea that Janine's murder, which matched his pattern perfectly, had been committed by 2 other men with no history of violence and no physical evidence tying them to the scene made no sense. Third, the case against Cruz and Hernandez was weak. It rested on a fabricated vision statement and the testimony of jailhouse informants seeking deals. There was no DNA, no fingerprints, no physical evidence of any kind linking them to Janine. Dugan's confession should have been a red flag, that the wrong men had been convicted. But the prosecutors had just won a high-profile conviction. They had secured death sentences. They had told the Nicarico family and the community of Naperville that justice had been served. Admitting that they had convicted the wrong men would mean admitting they had made a catastrophic mistake. It would mean acknowledging that 2 innocent men were sitting on death row. It would mean reopening a case they had declared closed. So they ignored Brian Dugan. They buried his confession. They moved forward as if he had never said a word. And Rolando Cruz and Alejandro Hernandez remained on death row, waiting to be executed for a crime they didn't commit, while the man who had actually killed Janine Nicarico sat in prison unpunished for her murder. Rolando Cruz and Alejandro Hernandez were convicted and sentenced to death in 1985, but their legal fight was far from over. Both men immediately appealed their convictions. Their defense attorneys argued that the trial had been fundamentally unfair. There was no physical evidence linking Cruz or Hernandez to the crime. The vision statement had been mischaracterized as a confession. The jailhouse informants were unreliable witnesses with clear motivation to lie. And now, a serial killer had confessed to the crime and been ignored. The appeals process moved slowly, but eventually, the courts agreed. The convictions were overturned. Cruz and Hernandez were granted new trials. The prosecutors could have taken this opportunity to reconsider the case. They could have investigated Brian Dugan's confession more thoroughly. They could have acknowledged the weaknesses in their evidence and reconsidered whether they had the right men. Instead, they doubled down. In 1990, Rolando Cruz and Alejandro Hernandez were tried again. This time, they were tried separately rather than in a joint trial. The prosecution presented the same evidence, the vision statement, the jailhouse informants, the claim that Cruz and Hernandez had been involved in Janine's murder. The results were the same. Rolando Cruz was convicted again and sentenced to death again. Alejandro Hernandez was convicted again and sentenced to 80 years in prison. For Cruz and Hernandez, this was devastating. They had already spent years in prison for a crime they didn't commit. They had been through the nightmare of a death penalty trial once, fought through appeals, and believed they might finally be freed. Now they were back where they started, back on death row, back in the system, back to waiting. Cruz spent his days in a 6-by-9-foot cell, isolated from other inmates, knowing that the state of Illinois was planning to execute him for something he didn't do. Hernandez faced decades behind bars with no clear path to freedom. Both men watched as years slipped away, as appeals dragged on, as their families aged and suffered outside the prison walls. Meanwhile, Brian Dugan had been convicted of murdering Donna Schnorr and Melissa Ackerman. He was serving life in prison. His confessions to those murders had been accepted. His guilt was undeniable. But his confession to Janine Nicarico's murder remained ignored, buried in case files, treated as irrelevant. For Thomas and Patricia Nicarico, the retrials brought confusion and frustration. They had believed justice had been served in 1985. They had tried to move forward, to find some measure of peace. Now the case was being reopened, questions were being raised, and they were being forced to relive the worst moments of their lives all over again. And slowly, public doubt began to grow. Journalists started asking questions, advocacy groups took notice. By the early 1990s, DNA testing technology had advanced significantly. DNA profiling had become a standard tool in criminal investigations. Evidence that had been preserved for years could now be analyzed with scientific precision. Defense attorneys for Cruz and Hernandez began demanding DNA testing of the evidence recovered from Janine's body. Semen samples had been collected and preserved since 1983. The technology now existed to determine whose DNA was present at the crime scene. If Cruz and Hernandez were guilty, their DNA would match the samples. If they were innocent, the DNA would prove it. The prosecutors fought the testing. They argued it was unnecessary. They claimed the convictions were solid and that DNA testing would only delay justice. They appealed every motion, dragged out every hearing, and resisted at every turn. But by the mid-1990s, the courts were no longer willing to ignore the demands for DNA testing. The technology was too reliable, the science too strong, and the questions too serious to dismiss. The DNA samples were finally sent to a lab for analysis, and the results were about to change everything. Between 1992 and 1995, the DNA samples collected from Janine Nicarico's body in 1983 were finally analyzed using modern forensic methods. The results were clear and definitive. The DNA recovered from the crime scene did not match Rolando Cruz. It did not match Alejandro Hernandez. It matched Brian Dugan, the serial killer, who had confessed to Janine's murder in 1985 and had been ignored for 10 years. The science was undeniable. DNA profiling by the mid-1990s had become one of the most reliable forms of evidence in criminal investigations. The man who had confessed a decade earlier had been telling the truth. Rolando Cruz and Alejandro Hernandez could not have committed the rape and murder of Janine Nicarico. They were innocent. For Cruz, who had spent over 10 years in prison, much of it on death row, the DNA results should have meant immediate freedom. For Hernandez, who had also spent more than a decade behind bars, the results should have ended the nightmare. But the prosecutors weren't ready to let go. Even with DNA evidence proving that Dugan was the killer and that Cruz and Hernandez were not, the state of Illinois moved forward with yet another trial for Rolando Cruz. This would be his third. The trial began in October of 1995. It was a bench trial, meaning there was no jury, just Judge Ronald Mailing, who would hear the evidence and render a verdict. The prosecution presented the same case they had presented twice before. They relied on the vision statement, the jailhouse informants, and the claim that Cruz had been involved. But this time, the DNA results were part of the record. The defense presented the scientific evidence showing that Dugan's DNA matched the crime scene and that Cruz's did not. And then, in the middle of the trial, something extraordinary happened. Lieutenant Thomas Montesano, one of the detectives who had testified in previous trials about Cruz's vision statement, took the stand. Under questioning, Montesano admitted that he could not have taken Cruz's statement on the date he had previously testified to. He had been on vacation that day. The vision statement, the cornerstone of the prosecution's case for over a decade, had been fabricated. The detective who claimed to have documented Cruz's confession hadn't even been present to hear it. The courtroom was stunned. The prosecution's case, already weakened by DNA evidence, was now collapsing entirely. Judge Mailing didn't wait for the trial to continue. On November 3, 1995, he stopped the proceedings and issued a directed verdict of acquittal. He ruled that there was no credible evidence linking Rolando Cruz to Janine Nicarico's murder. He called the investigation sloppy and stated that Cruz should never have been convicted in the first place. Rolando Cruz walked out of the courtroom a free man after spending more than 10 years in prison, much of it on death row, for a crime he didn't commit. The reaction was immediate and emotional. Cruz broke down in tears. His family embraced him. Supporters who had fought for years to prove his innocence celebrated in the courthouse hallways. But for Cruz, freedom came with a profound sense of loss. He had lost over a decade of his life. He had lived under the shadow of execution. He had been labeled a child killer and endured the trauma of death row. And all of it had been based on lies, fabricated evidence, and a system that refused to admit it was wrong. 1 month later, on December 8, 1995, the charges against Alejandro Hernandez were dropped. The DNA evidence that had cleared Cruz also cleared Hernandez. The state had no case left. Alejandro Hernandez was released after spending more than 11 years in prison. 2 innocent men were finally free. But justice for Janine Nicarico was still incomplete. The man whose DNA had been found at the crime scene, the man who had confessed in 1985, the man who had killed her, Brian Dugan, had still never been charged with her murder. That would take another 10 years. The exonerations of Cruz and Hernandez exposed one of the most egregious wrongful conviction cases in American history. 2 innocent men had been convicted, sentenced to death, and nearly executed based on fabricated evidence and the testimony of jailhouse informants seeking deals. A serial killer had confessed to the crime and been ignored. DNA evidence had been fought and delayed for years, and prosecutors had resisted admitting their mistakes at every turn. The public outrage was swift. Journalists covering the case wrote scathing articles about the failures of the justice system. Advocacy groups pointed to Cruz and Hernandez as proof that the death penalty was irreparably flawed. Legal experts questioned how such a miscarriage of justice could have been allowed to continue for over a decade. But the most haunting question remained. If Cruz and Hernandez were innocent, and if Brian Dugan's DNA proved he was the killer, why was Dugan still not charged with Janine Nicarico's murder? The answer was both simple and infuriating. The prosecutors who had convicted Cruz and Hernandez were humiliated. Admitting that Dugan was the real killer meant admitting they had been wrong for over 10 years. It meant acknowledging that they had nearly executed innocent men. It meant facing scrutiny, investigations, and the possibility of consequences for their actions. So even after the DNA results came back, even after Cruz and Hernandez were exonerated, the state of Illinois did not immediately charge Brian Dugan with Janine's murder. He would remain uncharged for another 10 years. In the wake of the exonerations, questions about prosecutorial misconduct became impossible to ignore. How had 2 innocent men been convicted and sentenced to death based on fabricated evidence and unreliable testimony? How had a serial killer's confession been dismissed for over a decade? And who would be held accountable for nearly executing the wrong men? In 1996, a grand jury indicted 7 law enforcement officials on charges of perjury, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The group became known as the DuPage 7. 3 of them were prosecutors: Thomas Knight, Patrick King, and Robert Kilander, the men who had led the case against Cruz and Hernandez. The other 4 were sheriff's deputies who had been involved in the investigation. The indictments alleged that these officials had knowingly presented false evidence, coerced testimony from jailhouse informants, and fabricated statements attributed to Cruz. The charges were serious. If convicted, they faced significant prison time and the end of their careers. The trial of the DuPage 7 took place in 1999. The prosecution presented evidence of fabricated testimony, inconsistencies in witness statements, and the deliberate suppression of Brian Dugan's confession. They argued that the defendants had knowingly pursued innocent men to secure convictions and advance their careers. The defense argued that the prosecutors and deputies had acted in good faith. They claimed that mistakes had been made, but that there was no intentional misconduct. They portrayed the case as an example of aggressive prosecution in a high-profile murder case, not a criminal conspiracy. After deliberation, the jury acquitted all 7 defendants. The verdict was devastating for those who had hoped to see accountability. None of the prosecutors who had fought DNA testing, ignored Dugan's confession, and presented fabricated evidence faced any consequences. None of them were disbarred. None of them lost their jobs. Some even advanced in their careers. One of the prosecutors eventually became a judge. For Rolando Cruz and Alejandro Hernandez, the acquittals were a bitter reminder that the system that had wronged them would face no reckoning. In 2000, Cruz, Hernandez, and Stephen Buckley filed a civil lawsuit against DuPage County, seeking damages for the years they had spent wrongfully imprisoned. The case was settled for $3.5 million each, paid by taxpayers, not by the individuals responsible for the wrongful convictions. In 2002, Illinois Governor George Ryan granted Rolando Cruz a full pardon based on innocence, officially clearing his name and acknowledging the injustice he had suffered. But money and pardons couldn't restore the years Cruz and Hernandez had lost. They couldn't undo the trauma of living on death row. They couldn't erase the stigma of being labeled child killers. The lack of accountability sent a chilling message. Prosecutors could pursue the wrong people, ignore confessions, fight DNA testing, and nearly execute innocent men and face no consequences. Meanwhile, Brian Dugan remained in prison for his other murders. His DNA had proven he killed Janine Nicarico. His confession had been on record since 1985. But he still hadn't been charged with her murder. That wouldn't happen until 2005, 20 years after his confession. 20 years after Brian Dugan confessed to killing Janine Nicarico, 10 years after DNA proved he was telling the truth, and a full 22 years after the murder itself, the state of Illinois finally took action. In November of 2005, Brian Dugan was formally indicted for the rape and murder of Janine Nicarico. Dugan was already serving life in prison for his other murders. There was no question of his guilt. On July 28, 2009, Brian Dugan stood in a DuPage County courtroom and pleaded guilty to the murder of Janine Nicarico. He was 52 years old. He admitted to breaking into the Nicarico home, abducting Janine, sexually assaulting her, and beating her to death. He offered no excuses, no justifications. He simply admitted what he had been saying since 1985. The case moved to a sentencing phase to determine whether Dugan would receive the death penalty or life in prison. The prosecution argued for death. They presented evidence of Dugan's pattern of crimes: Donna Schnorr, Melissa Ackerman, and now Janine Nicarico. They portrayed him as a remorseless predator who had spent his life targeting vulnerable victims. The defense presented brain scans showing abnormalities in Dugan's brain structure. They argued that he suffered from severe psychopathy and that his capacity for empathy and moral reasoning was fundamentally impaired. They weren't asking for mercy, they were presenting a clinical explanation for his behavior. During the sentencing hearing, Patricia Nicarico, Janine's mother, addressed Dugan directly. She told him it was too late for remorse. She told him that his actions had destroyed their family and stolen a bright, loving child who would never grow up. Her daughters, Christine and Kathy, also spoke, describing the decades of grief and the impossibility of ever moving past what had been done to their sister. Brian Dugan sat silently throughout the hearing. His head was bowed. He made no eye contact. On November 11, 2009, a jury sentenced Brian Dugan to death. For the Nicarico family, the verdict brought a measure of closure. After 26 years, the person who had killed Janine was finally being held accountable. Justice had been delayed, but it had finally arrived. But the story didn't end there. In 2011, the state of Illinois abolished the death penalty entirely. The wrongful convictions of Rolando Cruz and Alejandro Hernandez had been a key factor in that decision. Governor Pat Quinn cited cases like Janine's as proof that the system was too flawed to trust with the power of life and death. Brian Dugan's death sentence was commuted to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He remains incarcerated in an Illinois state prison where he will spend the rest of his life. The wrongful convictions of Rolando Cruz and Alejandro Hernandez didn't just expose flaws in a single case. They revealed systemic failures that put the entire death penalty system in Illinois under scrutiny. Janine Nicarico's case became a symbol of how easily the machinery of justice could convict innocent people, how prosecutors could ignore evidence that contradicted their narrative, and how close the state had come to executing men who had done nothing wrong. And it wasn't an isolated incident. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, more wrongful convictions in Illinois were being exposed. DNA testing was exonerating people who had spent years, sometimes decades, in prison for crimes they didn't commit. Some of those people had been on death row. In 2000, Illinois had a Republican governor named George Ryan. Ryan had been a longtime supporter of the death penalty. He believed in law and order, in holding criminals accountable, and in the finality of justice for victims' families. But as he reviewed case after case of wrongful convictions, Ryan's confidence in the system began to crack. In January of 2000, Governor Ryan declared a moratorium on executions in Illinois. He announced that no one on death row would be executed until the state could guarantee that the system was fair and accurate. Since 1977, Illinois had executed 13 people. During that same period, 13 people had been exonerated from death row. The system had a 50% error rate. For every person executed, another innocent person had been freed. In January of 2003, just days before leaving office, Governor Ryan took an unprecedented step. He commuted the sentences of all 167 people on Illinois' death row to life in prison. He cited the risk of executing innocent people as too great to justify continuing the death penalty. Ryan's decision was controversial. Victims' families were outraged. Law enforcement groups condemned him. But in 2011, Illinois took the final step. Governor Pat Quinn signed legislation abolishing the death penalty entirely. The Janine Nicarico case was central to that decision. Lawmakers cited the near execution of Cruz and Hernandez as proof that no safeguards could eliminate the risk of killing an innocent person. The abolition of the death penalty in Illinois was one of the most significant criminal justice reforms in modern American history, and it was directly tied to a 10-year-old girl who had been murdered in 1983, and the two innocent men who had nearly been executed in her name. These changes didn't bring Janine back. They didn't undo the suffering her family endured, and they didn't erase the decade Cruz and Hernandez spent in prison. But they ensured that future cases would be handled with greater scrutiny. Patricia became an advocate for victims' rights and for ensuring that the pursuit of justice didn't come at the cost of truth. She spoke publicly about the case, about the importance of DNA testing, and about the need for accountability when the system failed. She co-founded the Janine Nicarico Memorial Literacy Fund in 1996, inspired by Janine's love of reading and her determination to help other children. The fund raised hundreds of thousands of dollars over the years, providing literacy grants to schools and organizations in the Naperville area. The family also organized the annual Glow in the 5K Run, a glow-in-the-dark event that brought the community together to honor Janine's memory while supporting children's literacy programs. Thomas Nicarico remained involved in the case through the trials and appeals, though he kept a lower public profile than Patricia. Both parents attended Brian Dugan's trial and sentencing in 2009, finally seeing the person who killed their daughter held accountable after 26 years. Patricia continued her advocacy work for decades. She remained a presence in the Naperville community. In September of 2023, Patricia Nicarico passed away at the age of 80 after battling ovarian cancer. She had lived to see justice for Janine, to see reforms enacted that would protect others, and to see her daughter's legacy honored through literacy and advocacy. Janine Nicarico would have been 51 years old in 2023. She never got to grow up, never got to become the person she was meant to be. But through her family's strength and determination, her story became a catalyst for change. Rolando Cruz is now in his 60s. After his exoneration in 1995, he became an outspoken advocate for criminal justice reform and wrongful conviction awareness. He has spoken publicly about his experience on death row, the trauma of being falsely accused, and the need for systemic changes to prevent others from suffering the same fate. He received a $3.5 million settlement from DuPage County in 2000, though no amount of money could restore the years he lost. Alejandro Hernandez is also in his 60s. He has maintained a lower public profile than Cruz, but also received a $3.5 million settlement. Brian Dugan is approximately 67 years old. He remains incarcerated in an Illinois state prison, serving life without the possibility of parole. He has confessed to at least 3 murders: Janine Nicarico, Donna Schnorr, and Melissa Ackerman, and may be responsible for other unsolved crimes. He will spend the rest of his life behind bars. The prosecutors involved in the wrongful convictions, Thomas Knight, Patrick King, and Robert Killander, were acquitted of all charges in 1999. Justice for Janine took 26 years, but when it finally came, it brought change that would protect countless others. If you want more stories that expose the flaws in our justice system and the cases that changed history, subscribe and stay with us. Hit the like button if this story moved you, and stay safe.